Welcome to Lizzie U. My name is Merle Breinholt, and I'm ready to take you on another adventure with your TinLizzie18. Today we're going to be talking mostly about the frame, the Phoenix frame, and its advantages and its features to help you know how to load your quilt. I think you're going to enjoy it. To begin with, our Phoenix frame is made of high-grade steel. It won't bow and buckle on you as you tighten up your quilt, but it stays sturdy and strong. On the legs, you are able to adjust the height so that you can adjust it to be just right for your comfort. You'll also notice that we have 4 rails. The rail that runs through the throat of the machine is called the take-up rail. That is where you roll your quilt on as you finish quilting. The beauty about this rail on the Phoenix frame is that we have a hand wheel that will actually raise and lower it very easily as you need to adjust it when you actually add more quilt. Very easily done. We have this upper rail. That is where we pin the bottom of our quilt top. And the beauty of this feature is that we can raise it up out of our way anytime that we may need to get it out of our way or to check or smooth the batting as we roll our quilt. Now, this is the lower rail. That is where you pin the bottom of your backing. Now, I affectionately call this my belly bar because it helps us remember that the bottom of your backing is pinned on the belly bar. That alliteration sometimes helps beginners. The 4th rail is clear down near the floor. The purpose of that rail is to be able to store your batting that's on a roll, or even to lift your batting up off the floor should you have a large quilt and you have a lot of excess batting as you begin quilting. Very convenient and nice. Now, this frame can be used for the 18-inch throat and the 26-inch throat. All that needs to be done is to change the position of these front bars by moving them forward to make a larger workspace for the 26-inch throat. The carriage that goes with the Phoenix frame is extremely smooth. The reason being is there's 16 points of contact with these wheels. Very smooth and effortless to move the machine around. Now, also on the carriage, we have our encoders. The encoders tell the machine how fast we're moving so that the stitch regulator can keep the number of stitches per inch that we choose. We have 2 encoders. One is the Y encoder, or also known as the upper encoder. And as I move the machine slightly, you can see that the wheel is moving. The second encoder is the lower encoder, and it's on the very back of your carriage, on the back of your quilt table. That encoder rolls left to right, or on the x-axis, and tells the stitch regulator how quickly you're moving the machine. Now that being said, it's very important to make sure that your encoder is making contact with the rail that it's running on. We have spring-loaded encoders so that they snap down onto the rails firmly. If that spring is tightened too tight, it has a tendency to lift the encoder up. So we need to make sure that it is in good working order so that you are able to keep those rolling so the machine knows that you're moving. Should those encoders, one or the other, stop rolling, then you're going to get skip stitches because the machine thinks you're not moving. Now what you'll notice on your quilt, should you get a skip stitch from an encoder, is there will not be a needle punch in the middle of your long stitch, indicating that the needle did not come down and that the encoder must not be rolling correctly. It is important to keep those rails clean and free of debris so that those encoders can roll smoothly. If there is a little piece of fabric or maybe a piece of a pattern that you've got laying on the back happens to be on the rail, then that encoder will bump over it like a heel and hesitate a bit, and you'll get a long stitch. So keep those areas nice and clear for those encoders to run well. The cables on the encoders are very tender, so should you need to move your machine, please be very careful with those. Make sure you unplug them before you take the machine off of the carriage. It's easy to forget those. Now a lot of people have wondered what the back of the table is for, and that is where we can put pantographs and use a laser light to follow the design and stitch it out on our quilt. Okay, let's show you how to actually load your quilt onto the table. I have a small sample here. Now to begin with, it's important that both your quilt backing and your quilt batting and your quilt top are squared. Now I know a lot of times we take a lot of attention to squaring up our quilt tops. We want to make sure that they're beautiful and they're quilted well. You also need to square up your quilt back. When we're loading our quilt onto the frame, we need to pay attention to centers. You can see here that I've marked the center of this back with a pin, and also the center of this with a pin. When you put the quilt back on, we're going to line it up with the marks on the leaders. The leaders are these canvas pieces on our rails. They allow us to quilt right to the edge of our quilt so that we are able to get right to the finished edge.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Okay, now the rails have these encoders so that we can stitch right to the edge of our quilt. You'll notice that I have marked the center of my leaders. Now I've marked them all the way the full length of the leader, so no matter where it is rolled up on the frame, I still know where the center is. What I like to do is take the backing, or the quilt top even, and I toss it over the quilt frame just like I want it to be pinned on so that I don't get confused what goes where. I find my center And remember I told you that the bottom of the backing goes on the bottom of our quilt, goes on the belly bar. So I'm coming on this belly bar, which is the lower rail, and I'm going to match up those centers, making sure that the quilt back, the right side is facing the floor. We'd be unhappy to quilt the right side of the fabric inside of our quilt. And we're going to start pinning from the center. Now notice that I'm going to pin from the center to one direction with my points pointing out. And I'm going to pin them nose to tail. This is a very small piece so that we don't spend the entire time pinning. If you pin your pins too close, it's going to cause a puckering and buckling. If you pin them too far apart, you'll quilt little scallops in your quilt. Now, I'm going to come back to the center, and now I'm going to point the sharp end of the pin the other direction. So actually, I've had to learn how to pin left-handed, and everyone can do that. And the question is, why do we do that? Because we have a tendency to smooth our quilts like this. And if we do our pins with the points pointing out toward the edges of the quilt, then we will not be going against the points and pricking ourselves. Now I know some people who like to pin the last pin going the other direction, but that kind of defeats the purpose of pinning them out, the points out, so that they don't prick us. So now what I'm going to do is make sure my leaders are very smooth, and I'm going to roll this backing smoothing it out as I go till I have just a little bit left to pin on the take-up rail. Going to go around to the back of the machine and now I'm going to find the center of my leader with the mark and find the center that I've marked with a pin on my quilt back. I'm going to line the raw edge up with the fold of the leader and put my first pin in. And again, lining them up nose to tail. I like to use these T-pins because they're extremely strong. When I used corsage pins, the ends would come off and it added an extra bump where the pearl was. So I like these flat T-pins the best. So now I'm going to come back to the center and point my pins in the other direction to finish off this side. Now I've also used zippers on my quilts, putting zippers on my leaders. It makes it really easy to take the quilts on and off, especially if you're sharing a machine and you might not be quite done with one when you need to start another quilt. So we'll probably make that a video so that you can get a hold of that on our website. All right. So now I'm going to engage this take-up rail leader and roll it up just till I can barely see the pins. I'm going to make sure that this leader is nice and straight. Come back to the belly bar or the lower bar and complete the tightening. Now every once in a while you might have a side that's droopy even though you know that you have squared it up. And it might be very confusing. Usually what that is the leader not being rolled up equally taut all the way up and down its length. You can resolve that. I'm going to move over this way. You can resolve that by releasing the clamp on the rail that has all the fabric on it and winding your quilt completely up onto the take-up rail. Now what I'm doing is creating some tension with my hand on the belly bar. Now I need to roll it out to where my leader comes pretty much almost all the way out because it's the leader that's the culprit. I'm going to re-engage the lower rail and disengage the take-up rail, and now I'm going to roll my quilt back on and this helps to get that leader on equally taut. Now I find that this happens when you have a combination of quilt sizes. For instance, you might be doing a teeny tiny quilt like I have on there now, and then the next time you've got a 100-inch quilt, and when you're going back and forth between these, sometimes, for instance, right now I've got that center part of the leader quite taut, whereas the edges might be a little more loose. So maybe next time that I have a large quilt, I might have trouble with a drooping side because the leaders aren't equally taut. So I would advise you trying that method should you run up against a drooping side, especially if you know you've got a square back. Okay, the next step is to put on the quilt top. A lot of times people look at me funny and say, why don't we put the batting on next? Because we're going to be rolling this quilt top fabric up against the batting should we put it on next, and it would just move it around. So my theory is let's don't touch the batting any more than we need to. So now I can line up my center piece that I've got marked with a pin with my center mark on my leader on the upper rail. Remember, the bottom of your quilt top goes on the upper rail. And I'm going to pin it similarly to the way I have pinned the bottom. Remember, nose to tail so that we don't have any scallops. Now I'm coming back to the center and pinning in the other direction so that I don't get pricked by the pins. All right. So now
somebody's asking what's nose to tail.
Nose to tail, what I mean is the point of the pin up against the top of the next pin. so that the pins are almost touching and not quite. Maybe you might can move the camera over so you can see. So that the point of the pin is almost touching the head of the other pin. Okay. So now what I'm going to do is also smooth this out. I'm going to roll this quilt top until the very top of this piece of fabric falls off the take-up rail. Now notice that my quilt backing is about 4 inches wider, and it's about 4 inches longer than the quilt top. It is a fact that our quilting takes up more fabric on the quilt back. Now I find that it's worse in the length than it is on the width, so make sure you have at least 4 to 6 inches extra length and about the same on the sides. Alright, so now that I have this laid out, I'm just going to take this extra fabric for just a moment and lay it on this rail and lift up the rail out of the way. Now you can imagine how convenient this is with a gigantic quilt. When I get the batting, it's much easier to put it in place. I also have the center of the batting marked, so I can line it up with the mark on my leader. Now with this small project, I can very easily eyeball it to make sure that it's straight. But you can imagine that a 100-inch quilt, it would be hard to know exactly where that center is unless you mark it. And then as you roll your quilt, you might end up with a wandering piece of batting, and you end up with not enough batting on the end of your quilt, and that's not very convenient. Alright, so now I've laid my quilt top back down on the batting. Now we have some extra fabric on the side so that we can test our tension there. The next step is to baste our quilt top on. We have a really nice feature with our Android Quilt Magician where you can actually channel lock it if you're using the Quilt Magician. Today I'm going to do one side using the base stitch on our TinLizzie touchscreen. You can see that it's on the base stitch, and we have an option to have from 3 to 1 stitch per inch. I like to do the top with 3 stitches per inch. Again, we start in the center, and I'm going to take the pin out so I don't stitch on that and end up having to change my needle. I'm going to start in the center, and if you don't have the touchscreen but you have a needle button, that's what you'll be using here, is a needle button. What we want is to take a complete stitch to bring the bobbin thread up. So you take hold of the thread from your needle and touch your needle button or your complete stitch button if you're using the touchscreen. And once I take a stitch, I can pull the thread with my finger and move the machine away, and can you see that the bobbin thread has come up? Coming back, holding both of the threads. The reason I do that is so that it doesn't push a loop on the back of the quilt. Now I need to tie it off. On this model we have a tie-off button. If you have a needle button, then you would use your needle button, touching it 3 times and stitching very close but not in the same spot 3 times. So now I have it tied off. I am going to move to one side, stitching 3 stitches per inch. With our touchscreen, we actually have customizable handlebars that allows us to have a button that will actually tell it to start, and I can move it to the left hand side if I'm a left-hander. I'm going to stop, Now, what I like to do is baste my sides as well, because then the bungees will cause all 3 layers of the fabric to move together. So I'm going to tie off at the corner just because these are big stitches and they have a tendency to pull. I'm going to now stitch down the side using the 1 stitch per inch option and come on down the side. Now, if you have a needle bar and a needle button, rather than having this regulated basting stitch, then all you do is you touch your needle button and drag. And I'm going to do the other side that way so you can see. But this is a regulated stitch. And then I stop it and tie off. Now what I need to do now is bring up the bobbin thread so that it doesn't get dragged all over the back of the quilt. So I'm going to take a little extra thread from this side of the machine. If you can see, I'm pulling it down. And I'm going to move the machine away so the extra thread comes down on the quilt. And I'm going to come back to the same spot where I tied off while I hold on to that thread. Now I'm holding on to it so I can actually pull the bobbin thread up. I'm going to take 1 stitch, and as I hold on to that loop, I draw it away. Can you see now that we've got that bobbin thread coming up? What I'll do now is take a hold of all those threads and trim them off. Now our bobbin thread is loose and it's going to be able to follow me over to the other side. We're going to come back to the top center, just where we started, and I'm going to change it back to 3. Well, you know what? I'm going to show you as if I have a needle button. Okay, so I bring up the bobbin by holding on to the thread, touching the needle button, draw it away, bringing up that bobbin thread. See, it's free and clear because we trimmed it. I'm holding both of the threads, coming back to where I brought the bobbin up, and I'm going to tie off using a needle button. So 1 stitch, move it, 2 stitches, move it, 3 stitches. Now this is what you do should you have a needle button. Drag, stitch, drag, stitch, drag, stitch, all the way across. So you can get a really nice basting stitch this way. I get to this corner, and again I want to tie off just for the same reason as before, so that we don't pull the stitch because it's such a long stitch. Now I'm going to come down side, baste. So here we go. Drag, needle button over and over again. The nice thing about the ESP is it has the regulated basting stitch. But you can see you can get the same thing done using your needle button. Alright, so now that I'm at the end, I'm going to tie off. Sometimes I use my finger to keep it from moving too far, but I do not want it in the same hole. Again, I'm going to the side of the machine, pulling extra thread. I'm going to draw it back so that now the extra thread is at the bottom by the quilt. Come back to where I tied off. I'm still holding that loop, and I'm going to take another stitch to bring up the bobbin thread. Now see how I pull it out? See how that bobbin thread's coming up? And I can cut it off. Now when you're actually quilting, you use this same method of bringing the bobbin up. Now some people would like to bury their threads rather than cut them right off at the surface of their quilt. If that's the case, leave yourself about 9 inches of thread and trim it so that you can actually use a hand needle to bury the thread inside the batting. So now this quilt's ready to go. I'm going to go to the Lizzie stitch, which is a regulated stitch. And I'm going to come over and bring up the thread, the bobbin thread, just like I did as I basted. So a complete stitch, draw the machine away so it brings up the bobbin. Now I can see that you've got two threads there, and we're going to tie off. Now I'm going to stitch a figure 8 to test the tension. Why do we use a figure 8? Because it goes in all of the directions, left, right, forward, and back, but also the diagonal here when we're transitioning between horizontal and vertical. That is usually where the tension is tightest, and so this shows you all of the directions of tension. Now I'm going to look on the other side. I'm not sure if your camera can pick that up, but we can see that that is actually pulling the needle thread to the back. So I need to tighten my needle tension. So I'm going to come here. The tension adjustment is not very sensitive, so I'm actually going to turn it at a complete resolution and come down here, and I'm going to try another figure 8. The top looks great, and that improved the tension on the back. So a complete revolution with your knob, and I turned it right, which makes it tighter. Okay, any questions so far? Okay, Michael's going to read them. Okay, I'll just read some of these. All right.
Look this way when you answer.
Okay. Okay, we're having people say they can't hear us. I'm wondering if our webinar did not start as we did, so we might have to repeat some things. So I'll go back and repeat some things. This is part 2. Our first was about the machine and how to thread it, clean and oil and adjust it. And it is on our website in archive under Adventures with your Tin Lizzie, part 1. Okay. We're having trouble with it starting on time. Looks like it's mostly about the webinar not starting. This will be recorded so we can catch up on that, but I'll go back. One question says, will you be covering how to keep the rails from coming loose and working out of the rails? When they begin to work out, that also causes things to roll up unevenly. That, of course, that would be true, wouldn't it? Because then the leaders would be uneven if the rails are coming out. Now, I'm thinking that maybe the rails aren't in tight, that they might be slightly out of place so that they're working their ways out. Now, there is a mention about visual being disconnected or jerky. Sometimes that has to do with the speed of the internet that you're viewing at home with. The video that we have will not be jerky should you want to go back and look at it again. Let's see, we have several minutes, so I can go back and review some of the first things. Okay, so we're talking about some of the quality. So let's go back and talk at the beginning about our frame. This is the Phoenix frame. It is made of high-grade steel, so it doesn't buckle and bow. I'm going to bring up this thread so that we can actually move the machine over and you can see the carriage.
Go ahead and show the tension, the back of
Oh, okay.
tension again.
All right. The first figure 8 is our first tension test. The lower one is the second. So if we look at the first one, you can see the little pokies coming through from the thread, from the needle coming through the back. So I tighten the tension in the needle thread, and you can see the second tension is much, much better, much more, without any of the top thread showing.
Show it a little bit longer.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. Just remember that that tension adjustment isn't very sensitive, so a good whole turn usually fixes it. Sometimes you only need half a turn, but usually a whole will fix your tension. All right, earlier I mentioned that this carriage has 16 points of contact with wheels, so it's very, very smooth. And then we talked about keeping our encoders rolling. We have 2 encoders. Encoders actually tell the machine how quickly you are moving, so that your stitch regulator is able to keep up with the stitches per inch that you're desiring. So the one encoder that is actually the upper encoder is here on the right hand side of your machine. I believe on the Apprentice it's on the left hand side. It's a little wheel right here. It's spring loaded. It actually has a spring to help it make really great contact with the rail. And notice it rolls when I move backwards and forwards. And then on the very back of the machine, or the lower encoder, which moves left to right. Again, their purpose is to tell the machine how fast you are moving, so it keeps a consistent stitch per inch. We have the top of the line stitch regulator on the ESP models. It's important to keep those rolling and not have anything in their way, because if they hesitate or bump up against something, then your machine is going to think you've stopped and you'll have a long stitch. One way to tell whether it's your encoder that hesitated is to look at the skip stitch and see if there is a needle punch between the two that did connect. If there is not, that lets you know that your needle did not come down, indicating that your encoder probably hesitated for some reason, whether there is something on the rail, or whether the spring is too tight so that it's causing the encoder to lift up, or too loose and not keeping contact with the rail. Okay, so let's see what other questions we have. Okay, did you test tension on backing and batting only, not using the top? I do that most of the time unless I feel like I'm using fabrics or batting that might give me an inaccurate reading for the tension. If that's the case, I will take a little piece of fabric similar to the quilt top and set it on that area on the perimeter and stitch on all 3 to make it more, simulate more how my quilt top and backing and batting are working together. But generally speaking, the batting and the backing gives me the pretty good idea. I float my quilts, so I don't need the quilt bar. Can this bar be removed? So yes, all three of them can be removed. So whichever one you prefer to use, you can keep that one and take the other one off. What type of clamps should be used for side of the quilt and how tight should they be? Let me show you the ones that we have here. We have some little bungee clamps, and that's one of the reasons I like to base the sides of my quilt, is so these bungees don't have to be right on top of my quilt top. Okay, I'm going to come over here and show you. What I do is I put my bungees as far away from my quilt top as I can. And you can see they're really loose right now because I haven't tightened them. Okay, so now then I come back over to the edge here and I pull on it until it's taut, not to where it is stretched and misshapes the quilt. Now I'm going to go to the other side of the quilt and do the other bungees. We have some also that are kind of a low profile bungee that looks something like even a computer mouse. But these I like better, they're a little tighter. Now you can see I'm going to adjust its tautness. Now what the bungees do is they keep those vertical waves out of your quilt. Also, if you've got a quilt that has some wavy areas, it helps to keep it flat and flush so that you won't accidentally quilt some little tucks into your quilt. So those are the bungees that I've been using, and there are others to choose from. One thing to do is try to find some that are not going to interfere with your quilt machine so it doesn't bump against it. Okay. Another person says, I love this frame. I just finished my first quilt. I learned a lot from the jerky video and will watch again later. I was able to figure out the wrap, but your tips are going to really help. Thank you so much. Well, thank you. I love to help people. On the tension, when you turn the whole turn, is that, for example, from one all the way around to again? Okay, yes. So that's one way you can use the numbers on the tension dial, is if you have a number 1 near the top, turn it all the way around till the number 1's at the top again. So that's pretty much how I use those numbers. Sometimes we get customers calling in and saying, I've clicked it to 1 and then I click it to 2 and it's still not changing. Well, that's because that tension adjustment knob is not very sensitive. You need to make gross movements with it, gross changes with it. All right. On tension, when you turn a whole turn, is that, for example, oh, that's what I just read, I'm sorry. All right, Judy asked, I cannot find exactly how to secure the bungee cords to tighten. Mine are just loose through the holes on the frame. Okay, so let's have Mike move the camera over so you can see the sliding connectors we have. Mike, do you know the names of these?
That's just a clamp.
But this is a cord clamp, and as I push down on it, it loosens it so I can move it back and forth. When I release it, it stays tight. And that, when I put it up against the frame, keeps it from going anywhere else. I know that some bungees do not come with those clamps, and so you're tying knots and things, and that's just not convenient. It's not fast. It's not very accurate because you can tie a knot and then find out it's not tight enough. So it's really worthwhile going. You can get these at fabric stores. You can get them at Home Depot. So that I would advise you getting those because they're very fast to adjust. Okay. How much oiling is normal for hot conditions? Okay, our TinLizzies have a little dipstick in the bed of the machine. I'm going to have a little problem here. And what we do is, if I can get it out, is check that. So I would check it, every one of your projects. You can see mine's still shiny, so, oh, and I dropped it. It's shiny, so it shows there's still oil in the oil well here. That means there's still oil in the other oiling spot just above the needle bar. And so I would check it between each project, and you'll get a better idea just by experience. We used to say about every 8 hours of sewing, but quite frankly, we have a lot of different humidity levels where our machines are. We have some in Atlanta, in Alaska, and California, and in Arizona, and of course in Utah, all over the place with different humidity levels. And so I think it's best for you to look at that dipstick and make sure that it is got oil on it. That's the best way to determine whether it needs oiling or not. Also, you're going to be able to be more conscious of how your machine sounds the more you use it. If it starts sounding a little tinny or grinding, then you need to make sure you get some more oil on it. Will you be having a seminar on pattern continuation down the quilt? I'm having trouble getting the rows to be the right distance after the quilt is rolled. All right, if you're talking about pantographs, we can certainly do some videos, maybe even a webinar. It'd probably be worthwhile and probably would be an hour class. Sometimes we'd put videos on when it's short clips and have a webinar that lasts for the full hour, so that would be a good one. Now, if you're talking about nesting using the robot, those are two different topics, and we can handle both of those. I'm going to make note of your request, and we'll go ahead and do that. Make sure you have that help. Please review the direction comes off each of the bars. Do you mean the leaders? Yes. Okay, that's a good idea. All right, now the thing to remember, and we're going to move over there, Mike. The thing to remember is the leaders are going to come off of the bars the opposite direction that it rolls while it is engaged. So let me loosen. Which one's easier for you, the bottom? Okay, so I'm going to loosen this belly bar, and I'm going to show you when it's engaged, it's rolling, I guess, counterclockwise. All right, so we're going to hang it off, going that opposite direction. This one rolls that's clockwise, and you need to have it hang off. So these first front ones, they're going to hang together in the center between them. So this one's going to hang off clockwise. It's going to hang off counterclockwise. This one is going to hang off clockwise on the take-up rail. So really, the only different one is this upper rail. I hope that helps you understand.
So, in other words, and you probably have to say this so they can hear.
Okay.
In other words, you want the bottom of your quilt to come off the top of the rail, and you want your top of the quilt to come off the bottom of the rail, so that they're meeting in the middle and going under the take-up rail.
That's right. I don't know if you heard Mike. He's the cameraman. He was just making sure you understood that the quilt bottom needs to come off the top of the rail. Can you see that? And the quilt top is coming off the bottom of the rail, so there's no gap between them. They're setting together. If you could see that the quilt came off the top of the rail, then there'd be a whole 2-inch gap between the fabrics. and we can't have that. They've got to have it right next to each other. Okay. I have the falcon frame. The center support seems to loosen frequently. Is that normal? I'm tightening it frequently. Okay, I'm looking at Mike, our little know everything.
We'll have to check with them.
Well, I'll tell you what, why don't you email me at Myrl, M-Y-R-L, at TinLizzie18, TinLizzie, the number 18.com, and then I will be able to get some help for you, because I'm not sure why that's happening, but we'll find out and get back with you. So again, Myrl, M-Y-R-L, at TinLizzie18.com. Okay? All right. I love my frame, and your webinar is very informative. I have a bit of a hill in the center of my rail. It's smooth, but I can't definitely feel a difference, like going up and down a hill. When I moved down the quilt with the machine, I was told it was because my floor is uneven. Is there a way to fix this? Yes, there is a way to fix it, and will you please email me also, so that we can give you instructions to help you. It is possible your floor is uneven, but it's more likely that it had a little bit of an issue when it was installed. So we will get help with that. MYRL at TinLizzie18.com. We'll help you with that. Did you say you can channel lock the machine? If so, show us how. All right, I will show you how, but this channel lock is linked to our robotic system. And so I will show you how to do that, but it's not true for all TinLizzies unless you have the robotic system. Okay, so I'm going to move over here. Quickly engage the robotic system. And by the way, this is our Android Quilt Magician. I love it, I use it, I teach it, and we will be having videos on it as well. What I'm doing right now is engaging the cables, because the cables actually move the machine. Okay, it's all linked up. Now Mike's got this screen. You can see this is the touch screen for the TinLizzie, and right across the top we have a little robot picture. I'm going to touch him, and it opens up to our Quilt Magician, and it's telling me to tell it where the quilting is going to be done. And I'm not going to move it very far because of the camera. We're just going to move it a small amount. And it's telling me that my quilt area is 5.79 by 14.91. And I'll say okay. All right, now the channel locks are right here. Once I'm in the home area, they're over here where you can see these arrows. Now this one right here is the horizontal lock. So if I touch it, I'm only going to be able to move the machine forward and back, but not left to right. The one below it is the vertical lock. Now I'm able to move it left to right, but not forward and back. Can you see what advantage that would be if you're basting or making hash marks? Okay, so now the last one is cool. It is diagonal, so I'm going to go in and tell it I want a 45-degree angle. And now I can make a 45-degree angle and can't move at any other angle. So I can do stitching at an angle that I would choose. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to change it to go the other direction by placing a negative mark by the 45. And now it's going to move the other direction at a 45-degree angle. So the cross hatching becomes really an ease when you're using the Quilt Magician. This is our Android. We've had it about a year, and it's got a lot of fun features to stitch out patterns that are in it, just similar to an embroidery machine. It has patterns you can add to it. All right, let's see what other questions we may have. Okay, did you mention the high adjustment on the take-up rail? Evidently our webinar didn't start when we thought it did, so I did, but let me show you again. We have the take-up rail is the one that runs through the middle of the machine, and as we add the fabric, it's going to get more and more bulky, and there's going to be less and less space right here between the bed of the machine and and we don't want it to drag because that'll cause issues with our quilting. So I'm going to come over here to what we call the live end of the quilting frame. You can see two hand wheels. This one is to actually turn the take-up rail, but the one below it is actually to raise and lower the take-up rail. When you go counterclockwise, it raises it up higher, that simply. And to bring it back down, you go clockwise. Just so you know, if your quilt rail is too high, you're going to get skip stitches because that hook can't get in contact with your needle very effectively. Okay, we have time for a couple more questions. Many thanks. We'll email you with a picture. That's good. Are there rollers for the machine so it can move it? Do you mean on the frame? Probably. You can put big wheels on the frame. You'd probably have to adjust the level frequently if you're moving it around much, but that would be the only disadvantage that I could really see. Please repeat the 45-degree. I will. How do you clean encoders? I like to just use a damp cloth. If you use anything that might have any kind of grease to it, those are going to slip just like your tires on the freeway in an oil spill. So just use a clean cloth with a little bit of damp water, and I guess all water is damp. Or maybe even some denatured alcohol would be helpful. All right, so I will go repeat the 45-degree angle on the Quilt Magician. It is a channel lock for 45 degrees. If you'll notice, we have several icons. The angle is at the third one down. So we have horizontal, vertical, and angle. So I'm going to touch that the angle lock, and just below it is a little field. If I touch it, it brings up a screen, and I'm able to choose the angle that I want to have. So if I want 45, I touch 45 and say OK with the check mark, and now the machine will only move at a 45-degree angle. So the high point would be on the right and the low point would be on the left. If I wanted the angle to be going in the other direction, I come back to the little field with the number, touch it, and now I'm going to touch the negative point so that it will be moving in the other direction, so the high point will be on the left and the low point will be on the right. So here you can see now the 45-degree angle is the other direction. And of course you can choose any angle that you want on there. I can go and do a 25, which would be less obvious. So those are the channel locks. You can see the Quilt Magician has a lot of wonderful options, and you'll be seeing videos on that in the very near future. And yes, we would like to know what you want to see on a webinar, because we're here to help you. We're thankful that you joined us today. Sorry about some of the technical difficulties we've had. We're still learning, but the video will be online, as is the other one that we had a few months ago called First Adventures with your TinLizzie18 Part 1, and this is Part 2. I'm glad to be with you. Don't hesitate to email or call in. We love to help you. This is Merle. Come and see us again. Thank you.